Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. And I want to welcome all of you to this talk by my colleague, Elizabeth Rodini, the Heiskell Arts Director. And we're all really excited here because Elizabeth's new book has just made its way to Rome. It's called Gentile Bellini's Portrait of Sultan Mehmed II, Lives and Afterlives of an Iconic Image. And even she is just getting a first glimpse of it, and so she will be giving us a glimpse into it as well today. Elizabeth is an art historian focusing on the Renaissance. She earned her doctorate at University of Chicago, writing a dissertation entitled Translatio Sancti Marci, Displaying the Levant in Late Medieval and Early Renaissance Venice. And during this period, she was a Fulbright Fellow based in Venice. She went on to be the Mellon Projects Coordinator at the David and Alfred Smart Museum of Art at the University of Chicago. This is a museum founded by the Smart family. The name is not meant to indicate an unusually intelligent museum, though I'm sure it is. And in this context, I would just add that she's also currently a contributing editor for Smart Art History, an award-winning electronic resource for art history. And in this case, the moniker is meant to imply intelligence, and appropriately so. From Chicago, Elizabeth went to Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, where she taught courses in art history and cultural heritage. In Baltimore, Elizabeth was deeply involved in the museum world, acting as curator at the Baltimore Museum and at the Walters Art Museum. During this period, she curated numerous exhibits while simultaneously publishing academic articles on her specialty of Venetian art, along with writings on museology and the importance of public art history. Her current research focuses on the mobility of objects and the stories they tell as they travel the globe and interact with different cultures. And you'll see more of this in the lecture, I believe. Elizabeth is also a devoted teacher. Her sincere belief in the role of the museum as a lens for understanding society manifested itself in the program of Museums and Society that she established at Johns Hopkins. This is an undergraduate program that provides hands-on museum experience to interdisciplinary groups of students. A hallmark of this project was the development of productive working relationships with local museums, art and cultural centers, and heritage sites, all of which implemented in the context of the Johns Hopkins classroom. In addition, she was active in leading study abroad groups to Paris, Venice, and Florence. And in 2009, she won the Johns Hopkins University's Alumni Association Excellence in Teaching Award, which is a student-nominated award, and those are definitely the best kind. After working with Elizabeth for over a year now, I can attest to her energetic creativity in engaging with the community. But I can also attest to her frustration of the limitations that COVID has placed on her outreach. But as she herself says, such limitations just force us into even more creative ways of thinking. I actually began reading Elizabeth's new book this weekend, and I can recommend it highly to anyone watching. It's written in an engaging and a very smart manner that takes the reader on a journey through time and space. I'm so pleased to hand over the window to Elizabeth Rodini for her talk tonight, which she's framed in terms of our city theme for the year, and it's entitled In and Out of Istanbul, the Cosmopolitan Life of a Peripatetic Portrait.
Thank you, Lynn. I am hoping I'm sharing my screen with you. That was a wonderful introduction, and it's a real privilege to be here. I want to thank Lynn for being a really tremendous colleague in the real world and in the cyber world. And you know, the honor it is to be here with her as she really mentors me in the work I'm doing here, and I'm really grateful to that. And I'm grateful to all of you who are here in cyberspace. I wish we were together in Rome or somewhere, but here we are, and moving on. Let's get started. How far can we travel by studying a single painting? Today, I am going to approach that question with a deep, hard look at this portrait, the subject of my just released book, as Lynn mentioned, which is long in the works, and so it's very much on my mind. It is a portrait of the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, painted in 1480 by the Venetian artist Gentile Bellini at Mehmed's court. I'm interested in the journey this picture has taken and how its meanings have evolved from place to place, how it has been newly relevant in each context it has inhabited. My book frames this notion in terms of lives and afterlives, the picture's place in the world, but also how it has been remembered, imagined, and reinvented. Today, in keeping with the Academy's theme of the city, I will focus on several points along that journey, considering its reception and meaning in 4 times and places. We'll begin in Istanbul, or Constantinople, and focus on its production at the Ottoman court, asking what the portrait meant there for Mehmed, and attending in particular to its reputation for naturalism, what we might also call verisimilitude or life-likeness. We'll move on to London, or more specifically to the portrait's 19th century British owner, Austen Henry Layard, and consider it through an Orientalist lens. From there, we'll turn to Venice and to developing notions of Italian patrimony in the early 20th century. And we will conclude back in Istanbul in 1999 and today, for this story, as I intend to show you, is ongoing. So let's jump right in and head to Istanbul. Gentile Bellini arrived at the Ottoman court there in 1479 as part of an official diplomatic exchange with Venice. Sultan Mehmed II had ruled from this city since 1453, when at the ripe old age of 21, he seized the Byzantine capital of Constantinople and remade it into the seat of his own expanding empire. And I should note that for clarity, I'm referring to his Ottoman capital as Istanbul, though it long retained the name of Constantinople, and the nomenclature is complicated. The area in brown on this map represents the extent of Ottoman territory when Gentile arrived at court, again around 1480. Because of Mehmet's great military triumphs, particularly the famed taking of the Byzantine capital, the Sultan is known in Turkish even today as Fatih, or conqueror. In addition to being a great warrior, Mehmet was a vastly knowledgeable and effective patron of architecture, and here you see his great mosque complex above and the Topkapi Palace below, and also of the visual arts. He gathered the very best practitioners to his court from as far as he could stretch his influence, both east and west. In 1479, he sent envoys to Venice to ask for the loan of their most skilled portraitist. The Venetians chose Gentile Bellini, older brother to the now more famous Giovanni, and more importantly, painter to the Doge, or the ruler of Venice. We know very little about Gentile's stay at the Ottoman court, just scraps from stray documents, a few diary reports, and the influential but often suspect writings of Giorgio Vasari, the 16th century biographer of artists. And I point out that although this is an 18th century portrait of Gentile, it shows him wearing an Ottoman medallion and holding a picture of a man in a turban, indicating his lingering fame as the Sultan's portraitist. The portrait Gentile produced in Istanbul is often called one of the first, even the first, accurate representations of a Turk in Europe. Its scale, color, and lifelike qualities, including illusionism of space and surfaces, have prompted this interpretation, especially when it is compared to other contemporary images of the Sultan in metal and print. So people have argued, for example, that Gentile's portrait shows Mehmet ailing and sick, thin and kind of yellow in complexion. And he did in fact die within a year of the painting's completion. But this interpretation is problematic in that it takes a wholly European point of view. It assumes that the reason life-likeness matters is because it helped Westerners make sense of a distant people. thus fitting the picture into later proto-ethnographic practices akin to those found in the borders of maps or in the pages of costume books like the ones you see here. But this is not at all why the painting was produced. The patron, Mehmed, had no need to confirm to himself what he looked like. If he didn't have a mirror of the type that was beginning to emerge in Venice, he certainly had other reflective surfaces of metal or water in which to see his own face. Would he even have been interested in classifying himself for others? We need a different way of explaining Mehmed's commission of a naturalistic portrait. One thing we know about Mehmed is that he was a hugely inquisitive, eclectic thinker and collector. He read classical history with tutors in Arabic, Greek, and Latin. He owned objects ranging from Christian relics to lenses of crystal, and he patronized a range of artists at court, including many that he recruited to come to Istanbul from Italy. This portrait is by a local artist, but is clearly inspired in its rendering of the head and body by Italian forms. Mehmed was also fascinated by new technologies in architecture, armaments, and the visual arts. He even had a small collection of printed engravings, which was a radically new way of producing a single image in multiple. But the most important artistic innovations coming out of Italy at this time were representational. They had to do with a rising interest in naturalistic imagery, things like the study of anatomy, techniques of single point perspective, and other tools that supported the idea of a picture as a window through which we see the world as it is. And I put that emphatically in quotes. These are all, of course, pictorial conventions. So a move from images that looked like the one on the left to ones like that on the right, both in this case by Fra Angelico. By the 1480s, the greatest praise one could have of an Italian portrait was that it was practically alive, that all it lacked was speech. Now, Mehmed was a savvy student of artistic developments in Italy. He was well aware of these representational trends, and he appears to have been keenly interested in naturalism. These portrait heads are attributed to the young Mehmed, suggesting that he was not a great artist, but that he did have an inclination early on toward the peculiarities of natural forms. Several stories tied to Gentile's stay at Mehmed's court also echo this theme. The most dramatic of these, and also the most suspect, is that he had a slave executed in order to assess the accuracy of a painting of the beheaded St. John the Baptist. This story was often repeated, here much later in 1834 in paint, and it probably says more about European fears of the Ottomans than about Mehmed himself. Still, at its core lies this idea that Mehmed had an interest in the ability of pictures to duplicate the natural world. What I want to suggest is that when we look at this picture and think of it in some ways as true to nature, we need to rethink why that might be. This means relocating it to the Ottoman court where it was produced. It takes this form not because someone in Venice wanted to see what a Turk looked like, and by the way, Mehmed absolutely rejected the idea that he was some sort of typical representational Turk. We are better off considering this picture as a test that Mehmed set to Gentile to show him what the emerging mode of Italian painting could actually do. This, I would argue, is what the portrait looked like, what it meant for Mehmed at the court in Istanbul in 1480. It may also play into what happened next in the life of the portrait. In brief, it disappeared for 400 years. It seems to have left Istanbul shortly after it was completed, and it may have been discarded by Mehmed's son, Bayezid II, who was quite devout and disapproved of representational imagery. Rumors of the portrait's whereabouts enhanced its mystery and its reputation. It was never forgotten. I like to think it was rolled up and carted away in the pouch of some savvy Venetian merchant. But this history is hazy at best, and I need to skip over it here and take us rapidly to 1865. This is the year the painting enters the modern record. It was purchased on a misty October evening in Venice by the British archaeologist, adventurer, diplomat, collector Austin Henry Layard, who soon after returned to London, taking the portrait with him for conservation and study. With this, Gentile's portrait enters a new chapter in its history, one that binds it to some of the key movements of 19th century Europe, including imperialism, colonialism, and the related act of accumulating cultural riches from across the globe and displaying them to curious audiences in museums back home. Orientalism is the term coined by Edward Said in the 1970s to describe this relationship. Said argued that the lands and peoples of the Orient, what we would call the Middle East, were understood by Europeans above all as other, as foils to their own culture. The Orient was freely available for exploration and explanation, not to mention exploitation. But, Said argued, the resulting understandings were less about that other than they were about the self. What I want to propose here is that Layard's experiences as a scion of the British Empire orientalized Gentile's portrait of Mehmet. That as Layard looked at it from London, Venice, and even Istanbul, he made it over as a reflection of himself and his experiences. It's a proposal we can trace in a few different contexts. Let's start with archaeology. As a young man, Layard was one of those gentleman explorers who preceded the formalization of archaeology as a science. Not quite a tomb robber, but close. In the 1840s, he traveled to Nineveh in modern-day Iraq, where he excavated Assyrian artifacts and shipped them back by the crate-load to the British Museum in London. Here, we see Layard lording over the extraction of a great winged bull. This picture gives a sense of the imperial might that was required for these expeditions. And this is how the sculptures look today, imposing, but clearly displaced, obviously bolted to the museum walls, and mismatched. You can see one is a bull and one is a lion by looking at their feet. They declare their architectural grandeur, but with unmistakable reminders that they are spoliated fragments. A second frame for Layard's engagement in the so-called Orient was diplomatic. In 1877, 12 years after purchasing Gentile Bellini's portrait of Mehmet, Layard was appointed British ambassador to the Ottoman court. Like Gentile, he traveled as a government envoy to Istanbul. This coincidence must have seemed particularly striking when Ambassador Layard found himself meeting face-to-face with the reigning Sultan, Abdulhamid II, in some of the very same spaces frequented by Gentile during his own stay at the Ottoman court. In 1880, exactly 400 years after Gentile completed his portrait of Mehmet, Layard retired from the ambassadorial services, moved to Venice, settled into a palace on the Grand Canal, the Cappello, seen here in a contemporary postcard view, recalled his painting collection from England, and hung Gentile's portrait prominently on a palace wall. Now, did Layard recognize these parallel experiences? He never actually tells us, but in 1912, a journalist put precisely such words in his mouth. Although he only held the appointment to the Ottoman embassy for a short time, Layard often recalled it with interest when contemplating the portrait of the Sultan Mehmed II by Gentile Bellini. These connections may be coincidental, but they are also evocative, and they make me wonder what Layard thought about when he gazed on the portrait of Mehmet. How did his experiences reframe and reconstitute that historic portrait? This question takes us to the matter of Layard as collector. His relationship with Gentile's picture was highly personal, distinct from anything we might find in a modern museum. Visitors describe it hanging among other exotic imports, including marbles he had excavated at Nineveh and a collection of Hindu and Persian arms. And note the carpets draped from the windows of his palace. We see this in paintings by Gentile and his contemporaries around 1500, so it's an interesting historicizing gesture by the Layards, but also an exoticizing one. Gentile's portrait of Mehmet was part of the spectacle at the Layards' renowned house parties. One visitor recalled seeing it through the glimmer of torchlight, the sparkle of gems, the flash of gold and silverware among the hazy, darting figures of women on unforgettable evenings among Venetian society. Years later, another guest described school holidays spent with the Layards and having to shoo the family parrot away from the pictures. Now, we could simply write all of this off as the eccentricities of a private collection displayed in a personal space. Orientalist theory, however, reads such repurposing as an act of domestication, one that reduces the surviving traces of a lost society to a decorative gesture. We might take as a comparison Layard's collection of ancient Assyrian cylinder seals, which he transformed into a set of jewelry for his wife, Lady Enid, as you see here. She, by the way, apparently hated wearing her husband's exoticizing confections. In the scheme of Edward Said, Orientalism and feminization go hand in hand. This jewelry is another colonial imposition, here on the body of Layard's wife. What I am proposing is an Orientalist frame for Gentile's picture, a view of it, if you will, taken from London, the seat of the British colonial empire, from which Layard's perspectives derived. We can complicate that view further by considering this portrait, which shows a young Layard dressed in the garb of the Bakhtiari people, a costume he put on, he says, as a disguise for safe passage during his archaeological expeditions to Nineveh. This image returns me to Edward Said, prompting me to reimagine Layard's relationship with Gentile's portrait of Mehmed, an image of the self understood via a portrait of the other. Of course, Gentile's immediate subject is a 15th century sultan, and he was a Renaissance painter. But the complexities of experiences the portrait embodies are strikingly aligned with those of Austen Henry Layard. And so I wonder, how could this 19th century British archaeologist and collector, this Orientalist servant of London's empire, not have colonized Gentile's portrait as well, making it over as akin to his own personal history? Let's move now from the 19th century into the 20th to another stop on this portrait's circuitous journey. It is back in Venice, but the year is now 1915. Lord and Lady Layard are deceased and have willed their pictures to the National Gallery in London. The gallery is trying to extract their pictures from Italy before the rising forces of war make this impossible. However, the challenge that interests me at the moment is not military, but a rising sense of patriotism centered on cultural heritage and a growing resistance to letting Italian artworks go. Situated in Venice, Gentile's portrait of Mehmed was a standard for this movement, pointing ahead to the debates around national patrimony that preoccupy museums today. National patrimony is the concept that a people, or more specifically a nation and its citizenry, has an inherent claim to the ownership of indigenous cultural goods. The most famous case is the Elgin or Parthenon marbles, which were removed by Lord Elgin from the Parthenon Temple in Athens in the early 19th century and have been housed at the British Museum for over 200 years. Greece wants them back, and the conflict is not new, dating to at least Lord Byron's poetic laments of 1812 over their removal and defacement. A century later, the British ambassador in Italy pointed to Greece as a warning to the National Gallery as it sought to remove Gentile's portrait from Venice. The Mehmed picture is regarded by the Italians somewhat as the Athenians regarded the Elgin marbles, he cautioned. It's a fortuitous comparison, helping us make larger sense of the struggle over this picture by pointing in two directions, one historical and the other one more ethical or conceptual. The history is rather straightforward. Italy, like other European states of the 19th century, saw material heritage as a way of solidifying a sense of shared cultural and thus political identity. It followed the lead of France, which had developed the notion of patrimoine as an instrument of nation building during the Revolution. So the Italians began to write protectionist laws aimed at keeping the material culture of Italy in Italy. In some ways, this was a positive act of self-determination. Italy, established in 1870, was a new state. It was relatively poor in monetary resources, but rich in artistic ones, and so it made sense to consolidate a notion of identity around them. But there was also a defensive aspect to this concept, as the Italians watched foreigners carrying off their national treasures. The Italian writer Alessandro Manzoni foresaw this problem and lamented in a letter, "What can I say of London? The English have no taste, for in general they are anything but good artists, but in collecting objects of art and science, they are second to none." To stop this cultural hemorrhaging, Italian politicians began lobbying for legal control over artistic exports and writing related legislation. One of the first such laws, number 185, passed in 1902, took the form of a list of, quote, objects of great merit for history or art in private hands. It declared that these were to remain in Italy, ideally to be acquired by the state for the public good. Among the works on the first protected list was Gentile Bellini's portrait of Sultan Mehmed II, which the writer Angelo Conti described just a few years later as a work of Italian genius. But what does it mean to call this painting Italian? There was some logic to the term in 1912, but retrospectively or historically, it's not so simple a definition. Venice was an independent republic in 1480 and had been for 6 centuries. It survived until 1789, when it finally collapsed under Napoleonic pressure. By contrast, in 1902, Italy was barely 3 decades old. More importantly, Gentile's picture had been commissioned and paid for not by an Italian or even a Venetian, but by an Ottoman and in Istanbul. The Turks may have had a better claim to the portrait than anyone else. And in fact, from the outset of this debate, the British press treated Gentile's portrait as an object of international interest, tying it directly to modern geopolitics. Days after Lady Layard's death in 1912, the Leicester Chronicle declared the painting to have a, quote, topical interest and linked Mehmet to his distant successor, the beleaguered Mehmed V, who was fighting for the survival of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans. When the British people thought about sultans, Ottomans, and empire, they didn't need to check history books for points of reference. As the Pall Mall Gazette put it, even the Philistine in affairs of art will note the irony of chance that brings us the portrait of the victor of Constantinople at a moment when that peerless city, the gates of the East and West, is trembling in the balance. It is one of those flashes of coincidence that lend history half its magic. Paradoxically, it was internationalism, as well as a legal technicality, that finally allowed the British to take possession of Gentile's picture. Italy's new protectionist laws were directed at Italian material, and so they did not apply to works of art that had been imported. But Layard's collection had lived with him and even toured in England before he moved it all back to hang in his Venetian palace. Officially then, his paintings were imports and could not be retained under Italian law number 185. Thus, in 1915, under the threat of bombardments on land and sea, the British government arranged for Layard's collection to travel to the National Gallery. By April of 1916, Gentile's Mehmet had made it safely back to London. As I've studied this history, I have been, quite frankly, amazed at the attention given to these pictures by the gallery's trustees in the face of much graver, even existential dangers on the European continent. And it is a fact that has made me think harder about art as a refuge in times of crisis. And so we move ahead another century to December 1999, when Gentile Bellini's portrait of Mehmet II was sent back to Istanbul to star in a one-man or one-painting show. It was a smash hit with over 30,000 visitors in a single month. Newspaper coverage was prolific and the headlines grand. Second Conquest, Welcome Home Conqueror, or Fatih. Or here, Fatih's famous portrait brought to Istanbul. And we see the courier from the National Gallery escorting it off the airplane to a reception worthy of an ambassador. Visitors were equally enthusiastic. One of them told an American reporter, "We have seen this picture so many times in so many school books and on so many walls over so many years that it's really imprinted on our brains. Now it's finally here, the real thing." Exhibition organizers, journalists, writers, and other cultural observers agree. Gentile's image is ever present in the consciousness of modern Turks. I went to Istanbul in the fall of 2018 to track down what I could find of this picture, including both the history of its exhibition in 1999 and its resonance in popular memory. The final portion of my talk focuses on what I found there and what I learned about the power of this picture in Turkey today. I discovered a changing fate, that over the course of just 20 years, its status has evolved significantly, reflecting rapid changes in Turkish politics, both domestic and international. My research was conducted through books and online, but also through conversations on the streets and in the marketplaces of Istanbul. The exhibition of 1999 and the circumstances surrounding it reveal a lot about where Turkey was at the end of the 20th century. The intention of the curators at the Yapı Kredi Cultural Institution was to present a history of cross-cultural exchange, of harmony and balance in the late 15th century. Gentile's pictures stood at the center, flanked by photo murals that told, on the one side, the story of the Venetian artist, and on the other, that of his Ottoman patron. So the portrait, which was the only original work of art on view, stood for the flowering of a mutually profitable encounter between two distinguished cultural traditions. This perspective made a lot of sense at the time because Turkey was pressing its case to join the European Union as part of a world order characterized by unity and a shared vision, or at least a mutually respectful one. 20 years later, that vision is seriously fractured as President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, here in 2018 in a monumental political poster, steps back from Europe and toward a more inward nationalist vision for Turkey and its future, in lockstep with so much of the contemporary world. In Erdogan's Turkey, Ottoman heritage is less a point of connection than one of distinction, a way of making Turkey great again. He and his conservative AKP party have been reclaiming signs of Ottomanism that were discarded in the 1920s when Turkey, under its founding president Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, sought to modernize through a cautious turn to the West. Erdogan, by contrast, has embraced many Ottoman symbols, and under him, a cultural neo-Ottomanism has flourished. It's evident in architecture, fashion, advertising, television, and film. Most relevant to me is the new attention given Mehmed II, not only as Sultan, but as conqueror, or Fatih. May 29th, Conquest Day, is now a grand celebration, complete with speeches, parades, and displays of military power. I read Gentile's portrait in Istanbul across these two moments, 1999 and 2018, as a cipher of geopolitics, a reading supported by its renown and reputation. According to Orhan Pamuk, Gentile's portrait has spawned so many copies, variations, and adaptations that there cannot be a literate Turk who has not seen it hundreds, if not thousands, of times. My own research confirmed this statement, and then some. Mehmed is everywhere online, and Gentile's portrait is his default image. I found it in endless internet memes, but also on the cover of many publications, including works of history and fiction for all ages, on historic stamps and coins, and on all sorts of merchandise, even on a box of Fatih Sultan Mehmed perfume, a quote, sumptuous smorgasbord of scent, harking back to the exotica of grand bygone times. Anecdotally, on the streets of Istanbul, I was able to bolster Pamuk's claim that nearly every Turk knows Gentile's painting. Of some 130 people I surveyed, 95% recognized the picture, and 75% clearly named the subject as Fatih Mehmet. Many of the others identified him more generally as rescuer, liberator, or savior of Istanbul. But what interested me the most was the way their responses split along political lines. I'm generalizing, of course, but I offer a few examples. One was a 40-year-old man named Tahsin, who described himself as a classic Muslim and a conservative. Fatih, Tahsin told me, is the center of everything, and he distilled Turkish history and politics down to a debate around this figure. Those who do not like Fatih, he said, do not like us, by which he meant Turks loyal to the nationalist vision of President Erdogan. The people on the left, he continued, blame everything on Fatih. And in fact, those opposed to Erdogan and his conservative politics told me much the same thing. One said, I used to feel positive things looking at this portrait. Now it's repulsive because of government policies. Another associated the portrait with arrogance, unsupportable self-grandeur, and the dark days of neo-Ottomanism. For Özge Samanci, who wrote a graphic form memoir about growing up in Turkey in the 1980s, the portrait recalls a very annoying poster on a high school bulletin board. There, Gentile's portrait was captioned, "You were at the age when Fatih conquered Istanbul." For Samanci, this was a suffocating, judgmental message that summarizes her adolescence and that she associates directly with this painting. In Istanbul, it is fair to say that I found Fatih Sultan Mehmed everywhere and nowhere. Gentile's portrait is widely known, but generally so. It resides deep in the national consciousness, even if its history cannot always be named or explained. This is what I mean by the afterlife of things. Histories of an object that are not necessarily material, not necessarily attached directly to the object, but that weigh powerfully on how we understand it. When I look at Gentile Bellini's portrait of Sultan Mehmed today, all of the stories I have told you converge upon it. Each city in which it has resided, each set of residents, each cultural context reconstitutes the stories it holds. Narratively speaking, I might better have titled my talk Out and In of Istanbul, but the point is the same. Even as objects are static, their sighting and changes to that sighting significantly modify how they are viewed, and thus what they mean. In this case, a rather peculiar Renaissance portrait speaks to us of topics broad and timely, of representation and identity, of power and authority, of claims to cultural patrimony, and of the weight of nationalist rhetoric in our own time. And what, I wonder, is next? Thank you very much for listening.
There I am. Thank you, Elizabeth. That was awesome. And for those who haven't seen it, I just want to show a picture of the book, what you might expect. There he is. So we'll be taking questions via the chat function. And I think I've got one already. Hold on. Let's see. So Jeffrey Collins, if you would write the question out, I will pose it. In the meantime, while people think and write their questions, you know, as I said, I did start to read your book this weekend, and your introduction of how you met this portrait is quite different from what you've presented. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I first saw it in, I guess it was 2003 at the National Gallery. And it, at the time, resided in the basement of the gallery, the lower level, which is a space that was reserved for problematic works, works that were heavily damaged, like this work is, which is something I didn't have time to talk about today, works that are of questionable authorship, which is another thing we could talk about. Is this the painting actually that Bellini worked on at the Ottoman court? And you know, in the context of a museum like the National Gallery, which has such a tremendous collection, you know, a painting like this that has questionable histories can be placed in the basement. And these are all things I could talk about more, this issue of its condition or its authorship. But for me, these points challenged me, the point that, well, maybe it is really damaged. You know, about 90% of the paint apparently is repainted in some way. And you know, do we know it's the painting that Gentile produced at the Ottoman court? We don't know for 100% certain, because there's this big gap in its provenance. We don't know where it was for 400 years. For me, those opened up ways of thinking about it, right? That it provoked other sorts of questions. What is an authentic picture? What is authorship? You know, how can we know with certainty about the past? And maybe it pushed me to thinking more about how other people look at this picture than telling the story of the picture as a product of a certain moment, but really, what is its afterlife? And you know, and so really pushing us on the long view of the picture. That's where I came to. And its history of exhibition is also an interesting one that I could talk about more if people are interested.
Well, let me, since Jeffrey Collins was the first to write in, he has put his question here, so let me pose this. He says, thanks for a fantastic talk. Wanted to pick up on your last point that the portrait is peculiar. Yeah. Having looked at it so long, are there intrinsic aspects of the object that have prompted the varying understandings, responses, experiences? In other words, would any portrait of Mehmed have had the same history?
Wow, thanks, Jeffrey. That's a big question. I mean, why do I ask peculiar? It's an unusual portrait. I mean, there's a strange sort of arch that seems kind of neither here nor there. It's very elaborate. It feels sort of flimsy. There are elements to the figure itself where the detail that we see is extreme, whereas the detail of the figure is more obscured. And a lot of this, I think, has to do with condition and repainting, but I do think it adds to this sort of mystery of the strangeness of the work. I actually think that it's absence from the historical record, but the memory that it was there contributes to this fascination with it, right? People knew that it existed. Gentile Bellini, when he returned to Venice, was very set on advertising his experiences at the Ottoman court. So not only did he make drawings and things that still survive, but he promoted himself as someone who would travel to the court. He wore a medallion. He painted himself wearing the medallion that the Sultan had given him. He signed his name, sometimes, you know, remarking on this history. So he really worked to promote himself. And this worked because we know that a century later, the Ottomans believed that there were these important paintings of sultans in Venice. We know that in the mid-17th century, it was believed that there was a painting by Gentile Bellini of the Sultan in a collection in Venice. So, and when Layard comes across this painting, he knows immediately what it is. So this, I think this mystery of the strangeness of the picture and this gap in its history is what really kind of spurs on its ongoing interest into the 19th century. So it's the story as much as the image, I think.
So we have a question from Anton Julio Sorgini. He says, I was struck by the newspaper image you showed when you discussed the image's modern return to Turkey. It appeared that Mehmed's eyebrows were darker and his bushier. Is that right? Hard to tell on Zoom. Is there any reason to think the physical appearance has changed as the painting's been recontextualized across space and time?
Well, you are extremely observant. I was looking at that picture again today, and I realized that it looks like what that courier is holding is actually a replica of the picture. And I do talk in the book about a painting that was produced by Franco Zonaro in the early 20th century that is a replica of the picture, and it hangs in a museum in Istanbul. And I found that it often gets replaced. The picture by Bellini gets replaced by this replica. I believe that Zonaro was using a photograph. I believe he had seen the painting in Venice at the Layard's home, but when he painted a replica when he was working in Istanbul, he was working from a black and white photograph, because there's a certain amount of precision, but then there are details that are just off, including some of the coloration, the scale, maybe also his eyebrows as well. So this was another thing. I mean, I became very interested in tracking down this picture in the various replicas and copies that were made of it. And it's fascinating to me that there is this copy that hangs in Istanbul that often gets swapped out for the original. And it really frustrated me at first, because I would think I was looking at a reproduction of Gentile's work, and then I realized it was a reproduction of this reproduction. But to me, that just sort of, in the end, underscored how deeply this image had penetrated the kind of the visual culture. So good, very good observation. Close looking.
So we have a question from Ming Tiampo. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I was fascinated by your account of what Sultan Mehmed would have wanted from the painting. In your telling, a way of seeing what Italian painting could accomplish. Could you please say more about what he may have concluded and how the artwork may have been received by artists in the Sultan's court? Did it have any reverberations in Ottoman painting?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I do have to admit, I am not a specialist on Ottoman painting, so I can't go terribly far. But you will recall the image I showed by an Ottoman artist that sort of seems to be a hybrid picture. The head and the way the body is situated, where it has sort of dimensionality and space, suggest an influence of Western portrait making in the Ottoman court. So I think in the moment that Mehmet was acting as patron and bringing these people together, there was a sort of rich moment of exchange that we may see reflected. But it didn't last. I think Mehmet was somewhat exceptional in his interests. The story is that his son was much more devout and was opposed to the sort of representational imagery. So I think what took place in the workshop of his court probably were very short-lived. And so there's not a lot of evidence that I'm aware of influence of Western painting on Ottoman painting. It turned back in many ways to its traditional forms. And this really says something about Mehmet as a patron and really quite how exceptional he was and how broad-minded.
So how was it identified as the painting Gentile Bellini painted during its hiding? Who mentioned it? I guess the hiding is like 400 years.
Yes. So Carlo Ridolfi. So the hardest chapter of the book for me was chapter 4, which deals with these 400 years where we don't know where it is. And my approach to that was to follow 3 threads that I think lead in interesting directions. The first is, and I think the most likely, is a mention from about 1650 by another sort of biographer of artists or biographer of collections named Carlo Ridolfi, who mentions that there's a portrait of the Sultan in the collection of the Zeno family in Venice. It's hard to know if this was the painting or not. There is evidence in the 19th century that a Zeno family member sold a picture to England, which would make this not the picture. It's complicated, but that's sort of a trail that suggests that maybe the picture was in Venice, and maybe it had been there quite a long time, because Ridolfi kind of suggests that it's been in this collection for a long time. So one possibility is it hung in the home of a Venetian family, probably one that had strong connections in the Levant, and that this was sort of a trace of that history. Another thread leads us to a famous collection of a historian collector named Paolo Giovio in the mid-16th century. He claims to have had Gentile Bellini's portrait of Mehmet. This seems to be probably false based on a lot of different reasons. He may have had a copy of it. And there's a third sort of interesting trail, which is that in about 100 years after it's painted, the Ottoman court sends an Ottoman envoys to Venice to see if they can find reported portraits of sultans that were in the city. So there's this belief in Istanbul, evidently, that there are these sorts of portraits floating around. So there's a story that's persistent, that this painting is out there somewhere, enough that when Layard is offered this picture in what he describes as sort of these dramatic circumstances on a misty, rainy night in Venice, that he thinks he knows what he has. So again, there's these sort of threads of legend, and one of the challenges for me in writing the book was really trying to think about how we come to believe what we believe based on historical record. And this long episode is particularly challenging. So I really sort of trying to stitch those 3 narratives together. And if you ask me, I vote for narrative number 1, that it came back with some merchants and was in a merchant noble household in Venice.
Okay, we have another question from Nasser Rabat. Excellent tour of the history of a notable painting. Could the vague history of the painting's whereabouts between the 15th and 19th century begin to answer the questions about who really has a legal claim on the painting? Many contemporary auctions are deploying vagueness in the history of provenance to avoid embarrassing questions about recent acquisitions, which are suspected of being largely illegal. And I think there was another question along those lines. Has Turkey ever requested the painting back?
It's a good question. So I think we do know that painting that's hanging in the National Gallery is the one that Layard got. So we know that since 1865, we know who has owned it. Where it was before that, we just don't know. I think it would be very difficult to make a claim, for Turkey to make a claim to it going back to the 19th century. Although I do know that when it was requested for this exhibition in 1999, from the National Gallery, there was some concern that there might be some kind of claim being made to it. And so there was a series of kind of letters back and forth to kind of assure the National Gallery that in fact this was, you know, that this met their concerns. I don't know if the questioner is referring to a painting. A fascinating thing happened this summer in the city of Istanbul. The municipality of Istanbul bought a portrait that is probably related to this portrait and spent about $1 million doing that this summer. They bought it at auction at Sotheby's. And that picture, it's very unclear what the origins of that picture are. And it's definitely sort of promoted in the auction records as School of Bellini, Circle of Bellini, circa 1500, but there's really no record of it. So it's definitely, and this is contentious in Istanbul. It's a lot of money to be spending on a picture right now in challenging economic times. So, you know, that's a partial answer to the question. But it did signal to me how the power of this picture just continues, and how much it is caught up in these questions of national identity. So it's a good question.
That another person wrote in and was pointing to that.
Yes, yeah.
That was bought. Thanks for a great lecture. I was fascinated by the moment you hinted at, namely the moment that Layard might be moving from identifying himself with Bellini and is identified with the Sultan Mehmed. Can you say more about this moment in his life, his biography, and that may be from Benawam?
Yeah. Well, you know, it's frustrating to me because he writes so much. He's one of these 19th century guys who does so much. You know, he also was a collector and wrote articles on the history of art and edited a famous volume of 19th century art history. But he never really says anything about what he thinks about that portrait, which, you know, I never found that smoking gun. But I do know that he was very attached to this picture, and he does mention it a lot, and he calls it a treasure. He clearly tries to kind of up its condition and its authenticity. He makes claims to it that I think, you know, we would consider maybe less than fully transparent today. He talks about what great condition it is, and absolutely that it's this masterpiece. So I think, I don't know if that's the same as how he doesn't talk about himself identifying with it, but he clearly has a very strong attachment, personal attachment to this picture. And to me, I mean, I think it's partly this mystery of the picture that he's found and sort of brought back to the modern era, but I can't help also thinking that it really has to do with the experiences that they shared. You know, there are some really striking moments in his wife's diaries. She kept very detailed diaries when they were in Istanbul, well, really her whole life, about where they went and where they went with Abdülhamid II. And they went into the spaces that Mehmed had built, and they went into the treasury. And at one point they described seeing a tapestry that sort of reminded me in reading it of the tapestry in the painting. So it's so resonant of that experience to me that I can't believe he didn't see some sort of connections, but he never says that. He keeps his distance.
So one last question I think we have time for. Could you elaborate more on why Mehmed chose to portray himself naturalistically?
Yeah, well, I guess I think my argument is that he was sort of challenging painting, right? Well, you've got this famous painting, show me what it can do. And that is sort of my short answer to that question, and what I tried to address in the talk. I do think a related question is, well, what was he going to do with this picture? Was he going to hang it in his palace and admire himself or admire the art of the Italian painter? Or was it going to be a gift for someone because it was common to make a portrait and send it as a gift? Or was he going to have copies of it made to sort of share it? In which case, maybe it's a way of sort of showing his breadth of knowledge and his sort of sophistication as a patron. So I think another thing to think about is what beyond why he had it made in this way, what life did he imagine this picture having? He died and we don't know, but it might have been he was also intending something that he could share with the wider world. And I think that would be something interesting, another way of thinking about this. What life did he imagine it having? I sort of envision it as a very personal relationship, Mehmet looking at this portrait, but I think he also thought about it as something that he was going to send out as a sort of gesture of diplomacy and sophistication and worldliness. And that would have us looking at it in a different kind of way. So I hope that answers your questions.
7 o'clock, so I think we can let you off the hook now. Thank you for that inspiring lecture. And thanks everyone for being here. I'll just remind you that the next public event will be a conversation where I will talk with Andreas Scholl, the curator of the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, and he's going to be talking about the Pergamon panorama, which, if you have not seen it, is totally amazing. It's an amazing experience. So if you haven't heard it, go Google it and come back and listen to the talk. And that'll be on November 2nd. It's going to be the day before the American elections. So maybe something to get in your mind a little off of that. And now Elizabeth and I are going to go out and have a pizza.
Buona serata. Grazie a tutti. Thank you, Lynn, for this. Thank you, everyone.